Well, there's a premise that is the premise of many stories, many movies. And it goes something like this. You have a person who is not so popular, and they want to be popular. So it's a person who's maybe a little nerdy, or they have friends who are, and they're not in the popular crowd, but they want to be. So what do? Well, they change. And they start acting different. You could say they start pretending, because they start acting like someone they're not. Or they start acting like those popular people so they might fit in. They start dressing like them. They start talking differently because they talk like those people. But in these stories, in these movies, they usually end up failing and are eventually not really accepted by the popular crowd. Now, of course, if we're talking about a feel-good movie or a feel-good story, then the opposite is true, because someone will reach out to that person and will bring them in, and so they can become a part of that crowd. And in the end, everyone is friends. But we see this kind of thing happen in real life, where people try to fit into the popular crowd, try to be like other people. And we see people who will change in order to be liked, in order to fit in order to be popular. The thing is we even see this happen with Christians. And we'll see Christians who will change, or hide who they really are, or keep quiet about Jesus and about their relationship with God in order to fit in. But then you have, on the other extreme, you have some Christians who will do everything possible to avoid interaction with people who are different from them. And by different, I mean people who are not believers, who are not followers of Jesus. And so you have these two extremes, people who will just hide who they are to fit in, and people who will do everything they can to not be around or not interact with people who are not Christians. But the striking thing about Jesus is that he purposely went where non-spiritual people were, where the ungodly people were. And when he goes to these places where he wouldn't fit in. And you wouldn't expect him to fit in. But Jesus goes there and he doesn't change a thing about himself. But what happens? People flock to him. And today, as we look in our passage, we're going to see that Jesus is going to travel through Gentile areas. And he appears to be there and to spend quite a bit of time in those areas. And so we're going to read about this, about Jesus among the Gentiles. In the first section, we're going to see an unusual conversation. So look at chapter 7, beginning in verse 24. He says, and from there he arose, talking about Jesus, he arose and went away to the region of Tyre and Sidon. And he entered a house and did not want anyone to know, yet he could not be hidden. So here Jesus is going, we're told he goes to Tyre and Sidon, or the areas of Tyre and Sidon. Tyre and Sidon were Gentile cities, Gentile areas, so non-Jewish areas. The thing about the Jews, though, is that Jews usually would limit their interaction with Gentiles. I mean, sure, they spent some time with them. They would have business dealings and they would interact with them. But they would limit their interaction with Gentiles. And they even looked down on the Gentiles because they saw them as unclean, because they were sinners, because they didn't have God's law and therefore didn't keep God's law. But the Jews would look down on the people. And the Jews did not think very much of the people in these areas of Tyre and Sidon. In fact, I found this quote from Josephus, who was a Jewish historian from around the time Jesus was on earth. And he said about the people of Tyre and Sidon, he said these people were, quote, notoriously our bitterest enemies. So they didn't like the people of Tyre and Sidon. But this is exactly where Jesus goes. Now, why does he go? Well, the answer to that question is, I don't know. We're not told exactly why he went. We're just told that he went. But it seems that he may have gone to kind of get away and maybe to spend some time teaching just his disciples. Because you notice he says that he went there and he went into this house and he didn't want people to know. And so it seems like he's trying to get away, because you know that in Israel, when he went around Galilee, he was constantly followed by the crowds. So he had this constant bombardment of people. And maybe he was going just to kind of have some time to get away, or time to teach his disciples more specifically, more one-on-one, or 1-on-12. But he goes to this place where the other Jews would not expect to find him, and would not expect to find people who might have faith. They don't expect to find people who were seeking God. But he goes there, and we're told, yet he could not be hidden. That means people know about him, people have heard about him, and they're coming to him. So this place that is full of ungodly people, that place that is full of Gentiles, they all come seeking him. They've heard about him and they go to him. So let's keep reading verse 25 and 26. He says, "But immediately a woman with a little daughter had an unclean spirit heard of him and came and fell down at his feet. Now the woman was a Gentile, a Syrophoenician by birth, and she begged him to cast the demon out of her daughter." So this Gentile woman comes to see Jesus. So she is not a Jew. And Mark makes this very clear by telling us that she is even of Syrian and Phoenician descent. So she's not Jewish, she's in this Gentile area, but she is also a Gentile. But right away when she hears about Jesus, she comes and finds him. But this lady, she has a daughter, a little daughter, who has a problem. She's possessed by a demon and she needs help. And this woman hears about Jesus and she comes to Jesus. And we're told that she fell down at his feet. And in falling down at his feet, she's expressing her humility and the urgency of her great need. And she begs Jesus to help her daughter. Now, this word beg could have been translated was begging. It has the idea of a continual or ongoing begging. So it wasn't just a one-time request. She said, "Oh, can you please do this?" And then she was done. She was begging him. She was pleading with Jesus to come and to help her daughter. Well, Jesus' response is a little surprising. As we read it, we might be taken back. Look at verse 27. "And he said to her, 'Let the children be fed first, for it is not right to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs.'" Now, when we read this and we hear this, it sounds a little harsh. It comes across as a little harsh, maybe even mean. Because we just hear these words and like, who likes to be called a dog? But there's something happening here. But the thing is this woman doesn't appear to take any offense to what Jesus says to her. And we'll see that. But she simply takes it as an opportunity to interact with Jesus and to plead her case before him. And so let's just take a second and look at what's happening here to try and understand what he is saying. Jesus is using a metaphor, or you could call it a parable. But he's using a word picture to describe the situation. The children here would represent the Jews, possibly specifically the disciples if he was teaching them at that time. But it references or refers to the Jews. The dogs is a reference to the Gentiles. The thing is, even in our culture today, where dogs rule and everyone loves their pets, and it seems like some people love their pets more than their kids, even in our culture, people would not appreciate being called a dog. But the thing is there we have this, the Gentiles, it was very common for Jews to refer to Gentiles this way, because they saw both Gentiles and dogs as being unclean. Now, Jesus does use a more affectionate term for dog, like doggy or puppy. But what he's doing here, I think his point is not to put her down. He's not trying to make her feel bad. But he's expressing the idea that he has a priority in his mission. In his mission, he was sent first to the Jews. So he's expressing that he has a priority in his mission. And I believe he's trying to encourage her to have faith. And he basically is saying, when he says this, it's not right to take the bread from the children and give it to the dogs. He's saying that it would be inappropriate for him to stop feeding the children to feed the dog. And he says, so like in real life, it would be inappropriate for you to say, wait a minute, kids, you can't eat because the dog needs to eat. And so Jesus is saying it would be inappropriate for me to stop feeding or taking care of or following my mission to the Jews to go over here and do this, because he was sent to the Jew first. Now, this woman totally catches what Jesus is saying. She completely understands it. Look what she says in verse 28. So, but she answered him, yes, Lord, yet even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs. You see, she totally understands it, and she responds back to Jesus. In fact, it's very impressive that she understands what Jesus is saying, because you know what? When Jesus uses parables, even the children, the Jews, usually don't get it. But she hears it, and she understands it, and she responds back to Jesus. And she recognizes that he's not saying flat out no, but that he's inviting interaction, and that he's using this as a way of causing her to come to him, to keep asking. And so she responds to him. She uses the same picture. She's like, yeah, right, you wouldn't stop feeding the kids to feed the dogs. But you know what? Even the dogs, when they hang out under the tables, what happens? Kids eat and they drop their food. Well, the dogs, what do? They become the vacuum cleaner and they eat it all up. He says, even the dogs get a little to eat while the kids are eating. And so she's saying, you know what? The dogs even get some at the same time as the children. Now, this is the amazing thing about what she's saying. She's saying to Jesus, you don't have to stop what you're doing in order to help me. You can keep feeding the children. You can keep doing what you're doing. You can keep doing what you have been called to do first and still help me. She says, I'm just looking for a crumb. This little thing that you can do for me. And when she says this, it so impresses Jesus. Because she's expressing that she believes that Jesus can help her. And she's putting her hope in him. Look what Jesus says, verse 29 and 30. And he said to her, for this statement, you may go your way. The demon has left your daughter. And she went and found the child lying in bed and the demon gone. Now, so Jesus says, go on home. It's taken care of. Go on home. Your daughter is fine. And he says, because you answered this way. Now, it's not because she was just particularly witty. Although she kind of was. And it wasn't because she twisted his arm and said, oh, yeah, I guess you're right. I can do this while I'm doing the other. It's because she's expressing humility. She's expressing spiritual understanding. And she's expressing great faith. I believe you can do this. You don't even have to stop what you're doing. And she sends her home and says it's done. And she goes home and she finds her daughter lying there peacefully and delivered. Now this is just awesome if you really think about this. Because we've seen Jesus cast demons out before. I mean, we read how he has healed people, and usually when he heals people, a lot of times we talk about how he likes to have a personal touch. And so he'll touch them, he'll talk to them, has that face-to-face interaction. But here we have this story. Jesus doesn't go anywhere. I mean, he's far away from this child, and he doesn't even say anything. He just thinks about it, and it's done. That's the authority and the power of Jesus. He says to her, okay, good, it's taken care of, go home. And it's done. Far away and not a word spoken. And Jesus casts this demon out of this little girl. But this is the thing that stands out in this conversation, is that Jesus challenges people to have faith. And you have this woman here who was a Gentile. She was an outsider. She was not a Jew. So therefore, she was not privileged of having God's law. She was not privileged of growing up being taught the truth of God, and knowing what He expects. But yet she responds in faith. And I think that if we were to step out in faith, and we were to share the gospel with people who we might think are far from God, that we might be surprised at times when God moves in their lives, and be surprised by the faith that we can find when people believe, if we will challenge people to believe. Well, Jesus moves on now, and he's going to continue to travel through the Gentile area. And we're going to see a dramatic healing. So let's read chapter 7, verse 31 to 37. It says, then he returned from the region of Tyre and went through Sidon to the Sea of Galilee in the region of Decapolis. And they brought to him a man who was deaf and had a speech impediment, and they begged him to lay his hand on him. And taking him aside from the crowd privately, he put his fingers into his ears, and after spitting, touched his tongue. And looking up to heaven, he sighed and said to him, Ephphatha, that is, be opened. And his ears were opened, his tongue was released, and he spoke plainly. And Jesus charged them to tell no one, but the more he charged them, the more zealously they proclaimed it. And they were astonished beyond measure, saying, he has done all things well. He even makes the deaf hear and the mute speak. So Jesus is here, he's taking the long way around. So he had been up in Tyre, which is in the northwest, along the Mediterranean Sea up in the northwest. And then he goes a little further north to Sidon, and then goes far over here to the east and back down to get to the area of Decapolis, which is on the east side of the Sea of Galilee. And so he made a trip, and he gets there. And when he gets there, he's there near the lake, and some people start coming to him. They find out he's there, and they start coming to him. And this one group of people bring a man to him and ask Jesus to heal this man. And this man is deaf, and he can't speak. Now, here's the interesting thing. Jesus doesn't just immediately heal him, but he takes him away in private. He says, let's go over here. And he goes and he takes him in private, to heal him in private. And then later, after he heals the man, he tells the people, don't tell. Now, we've seen Jesus say, don't tell several times before, right? But usually that's been, or all the other times, that's been in a Jewish area. A place where the Jews were, where the people might misunderstand what it means for him to be the Messiah, or his calling, or his immediate calling as the Messiah, and might try and force him to become a political leader right then and there, and might try and force him to become king and overthrow Rome, or start causing problems for Rome. And so we understood that. Jesus would say, be quiet about that, because he doesn't want that to happen in Israel right then, so he can continue his mission and go to the cross when he's supposed to go to the cross. But here he's still in a Gentile area. A Gentile area, not a Jewish area. Now, there could be some Jews there, but he's in a predominantly Gentile area. So why would he tell them to be quiet about it here? And I think it's because in this Gentile area, it was not uncommon for these Gentiles to run and follow and watch magicians and people who could do amazing things. And it was kind of like an entertainment thing, but it was also something that was really cool or could help you, and they would do that. They would follow around. And I think Jesus does not want to be known primarily as a miracle worker. He wants to be able to teach them. He wants them to listen to what he has to say and not just be the miracle worker that people come to see, like the spectacle. So he tells them to be quiet. Now, notice how Jesus heals this man, though. Because like I mentioned, a lot of times Jesus would touch someone, he would talk to someone, but here he goes through this long process. We've talked about how Jesus doesn't go through a process and stuff like that, but here he does. And so what does Jesus do? First, he sticks his fingers in the man's ears, he spits, he touches the man's tongue, he looked up to heaven, and he says, "Be opened." Now, why does Jesus go through all of this? I think it's because the man can't hear. And so he's acting it out. And that's what I mean when I said it's a dramatic healing. He's dramatizing it. He is acting it out. So the man knows what's happening. He puts his fingers in the man's ears. "I'm going to fix your ears." He spits. I don't know why. Although I did read that there is some healers and things like that at that time would do things with spitting and stuff like that. I don't understand this part. But anyways, but he touched the man's tongue. "I'm going to fix your tongue." He looks up to heaven. Can you guess why? To say this is coming from God. So I'm not just a magician. I'm not just someone who can do tricks. But this is God healing you. And he says, "Be opened." And the man can immediately hear and speak clearly. And so Jesus acts this out so he can see that. And we're told again that the people were amazed. And the more Jesus told them to be quiet, what did they do? They went out and they said it more and more. They became more and more zealous. We've got to keep telling people about this Jesus. They told everyone about Jesus. They couldn't stop talking about it because he was so amazing. He said he does everything good. So I want us to see this, though, is that we have these outsiders here, these Gentiles, who hear about Jesus and they come to him. He helps them, but he's very purposeful to point to God. Now the Gentiles, they weren't as aware or as they didn't know as much as the Jews. So Jesus is again saying, "This is from God. I want you to know this is God." So he's very purposeful to point to God. Now he could have simply gone out and gained a following for himself. But we know that's not his purpose. His mission was bigger than that. And he also knows that these people's need is much greater than just having something healed or having a demon cast out or being fixed. They know his need, their greatest need, is to know God. And so he's very purposeful to point to God. Well, while he's there near the lake, a lot of people come. So not just that one group with the one guy who needed healed, but a lot of people come and they gather around him. And after they've been there for a while, he feels compassion for them. And we'll see this. Look at chapter 8, verses 1 to 3. He says, "In those days, when again a great crowd had gathered, and they had nothing to eat, he called his disciples to him and said to them, 'I have compassion on the crowd because they have been with me now 3 days and have nothing to eat. And if I send them away hungry to their homes, they will faint on the way, and some of them have come from very far away.'" So these people have been there with Jesus, and they've been with him for 3 days. Now, we're not told exactly what they're doing, but my guess is that he's been teaching them because that's what Jesus did. He was probably also healing and helping and that kind of, but my idea is that he was just hanging out with these people and teaching them about God and proclaiming the kingdom of God. But that also means that these people were away from home without food for a number of days. You see, these people came to see Jesus, and some of them came from far away, and maybe they weren't planning to stay there for so long, but they did. And they weren't prepared. You know, they thought they would just come and see this guy and then leave. But they came and they stuck around, and they've been listening to him and hanging out with him for 3 days. Well, after they had spent all this time with Jesus, Jesus is moved to help them. Because he cares about them. And he wants to feed them. Because he says, if I send them away, they're going to faint on the way home. In other words, he's like, I can't send them away hungry. It would be dangerous for them. It wouldn't be good for them. They go and they'll be traveling and they might pass out. They might starve. He's like, it wouldn't be good. It wouldn't be safe. It wouldn't be right. And so he's moved to compassion and he wants to help them. And so he says to the disciples, I want to feed them. Now, this sounds a little familiar. It seems a little familiar because we just saw a few weeks ago, Jesus fed how many people? 5,000 people. Or at least 5,000 men, so plus women and children. So thousands of people. And if you remember the story, Jesus said, okay, give them something to eat. Or they came to Jesus and said, Jesus, send these people away so they can get food. And he says, you give them something to eat. And what'd they say? That's impossible. And Jesus then said, what do you have? 5 pieces of bread or 5 loaves and 2 fish. He broke them up, gave it to everybody. Everyone ate, and they were amazed. Well, we weren't told that. We were told that they didn't learn. Because following that, Jesus went walking on the water to them, and they were scared, and they were amazed that Jesus could do this. And Mark tells us it's because they didn't learn from the bread. They hadn't learned to believe in Jesus, to trust Jesus. Well, here we have this story, and it sounds a whole lot like the feeding of 5,000 because Jesus is going to feed thousands of people again. But it's a different incident with a different setting, and it has different details. So Jesus is going to do this same type of miracle again. And when I read this, it seems like a setup to me. Have the disciples really learned their lesson? Did they really get it? They hadn't before, but have they now? We'll look at verse 4. And his disciples answered him, how can one feed these people with bread here in this desolate place? Did they learn their lesson? No. They say, how can you do that? That's impossible. Look at all these people, and we're in the middle of nowhere. There's nowhere to get bread. It's impossible. They hadn't learned. They had a second opportunity to exercise faith. In fact, it was almost the exact same situation, and they could have said, so what's different than before, where it's like they didn't learn from the bread about him walking on water? It's like those two different things, But here it's the same thing. We don't have bread. Okay, here it is. We don't have bread. Oh no, what do we do? It's almost the exact same situation. They had the opportunity to learn, but they hadn't learned. They still don't get it. Now, the better response would have been, okay, Jesus, how are you going to do it this time? Or, okay, what do you want us to do? How can we help? But they don't get it. Look at verse 5. And he asked them, how many loaves do you have? They said, 7. And he directed the crowds to sit down on the ground. And he took the 7 loaves, and having given thanks, he broke them and gave them to his disciples to set before the people. And they set them before the crowd. And they had a few small fish. And having blessed them, he said that these also should be set before them. And they ate and were satisfied. And they took up the broken pieces left over, 7 baskets full. And there were about 4,000 people, and he sent them away. And immediately he got into the boat with his disciples and went to the district of Dalmanutha. So he took what they had, 7 pieces of bread and a few fish, and he prays to God to thank God, and he breaks them into pieces, and everyone eats. 4,000 people eat and are satisfied. Okay, so it doesn't mean they just had a little, but they ate and were full. They were satisfied. They had enough. Then they go around and they pick up the pieces, 7 baskets full. These are big baskets too, so 7 baskets full. And they pick up all these pieces, which means that there was more than enough. Jesus was able to provide more than enough. And then immediately they get in the boat and head back over to the west side of the lake, back to the Jewish area, or a Jewish area. Now, I think that Mark is making a subtle point here about the disciples, and really about all followers of Jesus, including us. That sometimes we need to hear something more than once. Sometimes we need to hear things again. We need to hear that lesson one more time in order to get it. Because we'll hear it and we're like, okay, I got it. And then we face a very similar situation. We didn't get it. We fail to have faith. We fail to trust. We fail to believe. And so sometimes we need to hear that again. Because ultimately what we need to learn to believe. We need to learn to trust. We need to learn to obey. And I know sometimes I've heard people say, you start teaching and say, I've heard that before. Well, that's why we keep reading the Bible over and over and over again, because we need to hear it again. We need to be reminded. We need to be challenged to believe, to trust, and to obey. But the main point in this passage that we see here is that Jesus reaches out in compassion. He looks at these people and he has compassion for them. He cares about these people and he is moved by their needs. And when I think about the compassion of Jesus, I wonder how might I and how might you respond differently to people and to situations if we had the same kind of compassion that Jesus had? If we looked at people and were moved with compassion rather than whatever other feelings we have, how might we respond differently to people if we had that compassion like Jesus? And so, in our passage, that we saw Jesus traveling through this Gentile area. We saw him hanging out amongst these outsiders. And when I read this, I can't help but think about what it would be like if Jesus were here on earth physically today. If Jesus was hanging out among outsiders today. Or some might say, or would he hang out with outsiders, with sinners, with the ungodly? And that's what I'm talking about when I say outsiders. I'm talking about people who are not followers of Jesus, or I should say not yet followers of Jesus. People who haven't yet believed in Jesus as their Savior. And because they haven't believed in Jesus as Savior, they are therefore separated from God because of their sin. And the first thing I have to say about this, about Jesus among outsiders today, is that salvation through Jesus is still available to anyone who would believe. It is offered to all people, to all who would come to Jesus. You see, Jesus came to the Jew first, but he came for all people. And this is what God tells us in John 3:16, a verse that many of us know by heart. For God so loved the world, not just the Jew, but the world, that he gave his only Son, that whoever, did you catch that word? That whoever believes in him will not perish, but have everlasting life. You see, the gospel or salvation is available to all people, to whoever believes. So it doesn't matter what your race is, it doesn't matter what your nationality is, it doesn't matter what your social status is, if you're rich or poor or single or married or young or old, or cool and popular or not. It's about whether you believe in Jesus. Because our sin separated us from God. And God sent Jesus to die on the cross, to take the punishment of our sins upon himself so that we could be forgiven, so that we could be saved, so that we could be brought back into right relationship with God. And everyone who believes in Jesus, puts their trust in him, believing that his death on the cross paid the price for their sin, is forgiven, is saved. But as I continue to think about this, if Jesus were here today, to answer the question, would he hang out with outsiders? Would he hang out with sin? Absolutely. And I think some of us would be surprised by who he spent time with. Because Jesus had this habit of going to sinners. And sinners were drawn to him. And maybe we might think, well, people wouldn't still be drawn, sinners wouldn't be drawn to Jesus today if he was here. I mean, look how terrible people are. Look how caught in their sin they are. They don't like what Jesus stands for. But I think that was true of the people of his day as well. And I think people would still be drawn. In fact, I'm convinced that sinners, that outsiders, that non-religious people would still flock to Jesus because of his compassion for them, because he cared for them, because he loves them. And when they flocked to him, he would point them to God, and he would challenge them to believe and have faith. But here's the thing in all of this. First of all, we've heard this before, but I'm going to say it again because I think we may need to hear it again. As followers of Jesus, we are to be like him. And it gives me pause. It makes me think about that, because if I am convinced that people would flock to Jesus, then they should be flocking to his people. Because of our care, because of our compassion, because of our love. Because Jesus is living out through us. But I think sometimes we're more concerned with how bad people are, or how we don't like this thing that they believe, or don't like what they stand for, than we are about their need for salvation. But that's not like Jesus. We need to have a compassion for the lost. In fact, this is one of the things that our outreach team that has been meeting here, this is one of the things that we've talked about. How can we have a compassion? How can we show compassion to the lost? How can we be like Jesus to our world? How can we help? How can we reach out with compassion? And I think we need to ask God to give us a heart like Jesus. And we need to have a heart like Jesus because we are his ambassadors. And being ambassadors means that we're his representatives. It means that we go out and we tell people about Jesus, but it also means that we act like him. And that includes going to people who don't know him. Let me read for you Colossians 4, verses 5 and 6. Paul writes this: "Conduct yourself wisely toward outsiders, making the best use of the time. Let your speech always be gracious, seasoned with salt, so that you may know how you ought to answer each person." When I read the Bible, the biblical assumption is that we will be amongst outsiders, that we will be amongst non-believers, that we will be out there in the world. Because this is how we can be ambassadors. Because if we're not mixing with people who don't know Jesus, then we're not being ambassadors. We got to be amongst people. We got to find some common ground so we can tell them about Jesus. You see, this is how Jesus is amongst outsiders today. It's through us. We need to go out as his people and bring Jesus to them. I think a lot of times we just want to try and bring people to us. But it means we have to step out of our comfort zone. It means we have to go to them and invite them in. Tell them about Jesus. Live a life before them. Let me read that verse for you once again. Conduct yourself wisely toward outsiders, making the best use of your time. Let your speech always be gracious, seasoned with salt, so that you may know how you ought to answer each person. He's saying, conduct yourself wisely. Conduct yourself, in other words, live like Jesus. And living like Jesus includes both being holy and being loving, caring, compassionate. And when we go out and we act like Jesus, it leads to conversations. It leads to questions about Jesus, questions about who we are, questions about our faith. So let me just wrap it up with these words. So as a follower of Jesus, reach out in compassion. Point people to Jesus and challenge them to believe.